She stood in the doorway holding groceries while Chidi's family laughed at her stained dress. His mistress sat in her chair. His mother called her disposable. That same morning, her husband signed a life insurance policy on her life, with his mistress listed as the one who would cash it in. But none of them knew that morning a lawyer had signed over $40 billion to the woman they were throwing away. There is a kind of cruelty that doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. It just sits at the dinner table, pours itself a glass of wine, and pretends you don't exist. That was the world Eshe walked into every single day of her marriage, a world where she gave everything and received nothing but silence, side eyes, and the slow erosion of her own name. Eshe had been married to Chidi for 11 years. 11 years of cooking meals that went unthanked. 11 years of ironing his shirts before the sun came up. 11 years of waiting for a man who came home smelling like a perfume that wasn't hers and offering explanations that weren't real. She worked double shifts as a janitor at Mercy General Hospital, scrubbing floors under fluorescent lights while the city slept, and every night she came home, she'd find his side of the bed cold and his phone face down on the nightstand like it had something to hide. But Eshe never complained. Not once. Not to her coworkers. Not to her one friend at church. Not even to herself in those quiet moments between shifts when the exhaustion felt heavy enough to break her. She'd been raised to endure. She'd been raised to believe that love was not a feeling. It was a decision you made every single morning when you got up and chose the same person again, even when they stopped choosing you a long time ago. That Friday evening she came home late from her second shift. Her scrubs were stained with floor cleaner and something that looked like coffee someone had spilled outside the emergency room. Her shoes were worn down at the heels. She carried 4 bags of groceries she'd bought with her own paycheck, because Chidi had stopped contributing to the household bills months ago, claiming his real estate commissions were slow. She pushed open the front door, expecting an empty house the way it usually was. Instead, she walked into a dining room full of laughter. Chidi sat at the head of the table in a shirt she hadn't ironed. A new shirt, something she'd never seen before. Beside him in Eshe's chair sat a woman named Vivian. Long nails. Designer dress, gold hoops catching the light from the chandelier Eshe had saved 3 months to buy. Vivian held a wine glass like she'd been sitting in that chair her whole life. Across from them sat Chidi's mother, Lorraine, a woman who had never once said a kind word to Eshe in 11 years of marriage. Lorraine was laughing at something Vivian had said, touching her hand like they were old friends. Chidi's sister, Gwen, was beside Lorraine, pouring wine, phone propped against a vase, recording the whole scene for her social media. And at the far end of the table, quiet and stiff, sat Chidi's younger brother, Terrence. His eyes were down. His jaw was tight. He looked like a man who wanted to say something but didn't have the spine to say it. Nobody looked up when Eshe walked in. Nobody said hello. Nobody offered to take a single bag from her hands. Lorraine was the first to acknowledge her. She looked Eshe up and down, from her scuffed shoes to her wrinkled scrubs to the grocery bags hanging from her tired fingers, and said, loud enough for every person at that table to hear, "See, Chidi, this is what a real woman looks like." She gestured toward Vivian with her wine glass. Not someone who comes home smelling like bleach and floor wax every night. Vivian smiled, not a shy smile. A satisfied one, the kind of smile that says, "I already won and we both know it." Gwen laughed and tilted her phone toward Eshe like she was recording a joke. Chidi didn't even turn around. He just said, without looking, "You're late again. Put the groceries in the kitchen." Eshe stood there for 3 full seconds. The bags were cutting into her fingers. The laughter from the table hung in the air like smoke. Her hand drifted to the small gold locket around her neck, the one her grandmother had given her when she was 10 years old. Inside that locket was a tiny, faded photograph and a folded note that read, You are worth more than they will ever know. She felt the cool metal under her fingertips. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't say a word. She walked quietly into the kitchen, set the bags on the counter, and stood alone by the sink, listening to them laugh in the next room like she didn't exist. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A voicemail from an unknown number, a woman's voice, calm and professional. Ms. Eshe Carter, this is attorney Elaine Warren. I'm reaching out regarding the estate of Theodore Raymond Carter. It is urgent that you return my call at your earliest convenience. Eshe stared at the screen. She didn't recognize the name. She was too tired to think about it. She was too tired to think about anything. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and began putting away groceries one bag at a time, the laughter still floating in from the dining room like a song she wasn't meant to hear. Outside, after the dishes were done and the guests were leaving, Chidi walked Vivian to her car. The two of them stood in the driveway under the porch light. Vivian leaned against the car door and ran her fingers down Chidi's tie. She whispered, "When are we doing the insurance thing?" Chidi kissed her forehead gently, like she was the woman he'd made vows to. "This week," he said. "Calvin's got the paperwork ready. We just need to sign." To understand who Eshe truly was, you have to go back. You have to leave the cold kitchen and the cruel laughter and travel south, down past the city lights and the highway noise, to a small clapboard house on a dirt road just outside Augusta, Georgia, where a little girl sat on a wooden porch with her grandmother and learned what love was supposed to feel like before the world taught her otherwise. Eshe was raised by her grandmother, Ruth. Her mother had left when Eshe was 2, just packed a bag one night and never came back. Her father was a name on a birth certificate and nothing more, so Ruth became everything: mother, father, teacher, shelter. Ruth was a tall, quiet woman with hands that had known hard work since childhood and a voice that carried hymns and scripture with equal weight. She braided Eshe's hair every Sunday morning on that porch and told her stories about the family, about people who had come from nothing and built lives with their bare hands and their unbroken faith. One warm evening when the fireflies were just beginning to light up the yard, Ruth told Eshe about her brother Theodore. "He was a strange man," Ruth said softly, pulling the comb gently through Eshe's thick hair. "Quiet as a shadow, brilliant in a way that made people nervous. He left this town before you were born and went up north. Never came back, not once. But he never forgot where he came from. He'd send me money sometimes, no letter, no phone call, just an envelope with cash and no return address." Young Eshe asked why nobody in the family ever talked about him. Ruth smiled sadly and tied off a braid. "Because people don't celebrate what they don't understand, baby. They fear it. And then they pretend it doesn't exist. That's what this family did to Theodore. And that's what the world will try to do to you if you let it." That night, before Eshe went to bed, Ruth placed a small gold locket in her palm. She opened it and showed her what was inside. A tiny photograph of Ruth as a young woman, her smile wide and unguarded, and a folded note written in faded ink. "You are worth more than they will ever know." Ruth closed the locket gently in Eshe's small hand and said, "Whenever the world makes you feel small, you hold this. You hear me? Your worth ain't something other people get to decide. Not a husband, not a boss, not a mother-in-law, nobody. You decide." Eshe wore that locket every single day of her life, from that night forward, through middle school, through high school, through the years she worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college, through her wedding day when she tucked it inside her dress because Chidi said it didn't match her gown. She never took it off. It was the one thing in her life that nobody could take from her. She was the kind of child who walked younger kids home from school so they wouldn't have to go alone, who fed stray cats behind the church and gave them names, who sat with the elderly widow next door every Saturday afternoon and read to her from the newspaper because nobody else would visit. Eshe didn't have much growing up, but what she had, she gave without hesitation. That was her nature. That was the woman Ruth built with love, patience, and a front porch in Georgia. Now, decades later, that same woman stood alone in a hospital hallway at 5 in the morning, mop in hand, locket tucked safely inside her scrubs, scrubbing tile floors that nobody would ever thank her for cleaning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her back ached. Her knees hurt from kneeling. A co-worker named Faye once asked her, during a break in the supply closet, why she stayed with Chidi, why she never complained, why she kept going back to a house that treated her like a stranger. Eshe paused. She leaned on her mop handle and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "He wasn't always like this. There was a time he'd hold my hand in the grocery store just because he wanted to. I keep hoping the man I married is still in there somewhere, buried under whatever changed him." But that man was gone, and what had replaced him was something Eshe could not fix with patience, prayer, or the stubborn belief that people return to who they once were. Some people don't go back, they just go further away. Meanwhile, in a mahogany-paneled office 200 miles north, attorney Elaine Warren sat behind a desk covered in legal documents and rubbed her temples in frustration. She had been trying to reach Eshe for 2 solid weeks. Theodore Raymond Carter, Ruth's younger brother, had passed away quietly in his Connecticut home at the age of 91. He had never married, never had children, never attended a family reunion or answered a Christmas card. But in his lifetime, silently and methodically, he had built one of the largest private investment portfolios in American history. $40 billion in diversified assets, real estate holdings, and equity stakes across 3 continents. All of it left in a handwritten will to one person. His instructions were clear and specific. "Everything goes to the child of my sister Ruth, the one who never asked me for a single thing. She is the only one who carries Ruth's heart." Elaine stared at the file. She picked up her phone, dialed Eshe's number again, and listened to it ring into voicemail for the 14th time. She set the phone down and muttered to herself, $40 billion, and this woman won't answer her phone. The following Tuesday, Chidi woke up early, which was unusual for a man who hadn't set an alarm in months. He showered, shaved, put on his best navy suit, and splashed on cologne that Vivian had bought him for his birthday, a bottle that sat on his dresser in plain sight, as if Eshe wouldn't notice, or as if he no longer cared whether she did. He drove across town to the office of Calvin Monroe, a licensed insurance agent who operated out of a clean, professional suite on the east side of the city. Vivian rode beside him in the passenger seat, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone, already spending money in her imagination. They sat across from Calvin's desk like a married couple buying their first home. Chidi slid the forms forward. He wanted a $5 million life insurance policy on his wife, Eshe. The beneficiary would be a trust, a shell entity Chidi had quietly set up through a college friend who practiced law on the side and didn't ask too many questions. Vivian's name was buried inside that trust as the sole recipient. Calvin looked at the paperwork carefully. He looked at Chidi, sitting upright in his suit like a man with nothing to hide. He looked at Vivian, who was already checking her nails. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The quiet instinct of a man who had been in this business for 18 years and had learned to read what people didn't say out loud. Calvin processed the forms. He asked the standard underwriting questions. He didn't raise an eyebrow, and when he turned to the section listing the insured and saw the wife's full legal name, Eshe Ruth Carter, he paused, not long enough for Chidi or Vivian to notice. Just a breath, a flicker of recognition behind his professional mask. He had seen that name somewhere, recently, in a headline, on a financial news scroll at the bottom of a television screen. He couldn't quite place it in the moment, but something in his gut told him to remember it. So he filed the paperwork, shook their hands with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, watched them walk out of his office arm in arm, and then sat back down at his desk, opened his laptop, and typed the name into a search engine. What came back made him lean slowly against his chair and exhale through his nose like a man who had just seen a car accident happen in slow motion. National headlines, wire service reports, financial journals, Bloomberg, Reuters, The Wall Street Journal, Theodore Raymond Carter, reclusive black billionaire and self-made investor, dead at 91, sole heir to his entire $40 billion estate, a woman named Eshe Ruth Carter. Calvin read the article twice. Then he read it a third time. The same woman, the same full name. The woman whose husband had just walked into his office, smiling and relaxed, and taken out a $5 million insurance policy on her life, with his girlfriend hidden behind a trust as the person who would collect everything if she died. Calvin closed his laptop slowly. He stared at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Back at the house, the cruelty wasn't building anymore. It had settled in. It had made itself comfortable. Chidi came home later every night, sometimes not until 2 or 3 in the morning. He stopped eating Eshe's cooking entirely. She'd prepare dinner, baked chicken, rice, collard greens, the meals she'd learned from Ruth, and he'd walk past the table without looking, grab his keys, and leave. The plates would sit there untouched until Eshe wrapped them in foil and put them in the fridge, hoping maybe tomorrow he'd sit down with her. He never did. Lorraine started coming over more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week, sitting in the living room like she owned the place, drinking tea from Eshe's cups, making comments designed to cut. "You know, Chidi, a man with your potential deserves a woman who elevates him, someone with ambition, someone who doesn't come home with her hands smelling like chemicals." She'd say these things while Eshe was in the next room, knowing full well she could hear every word. Sometimes she'd say them while looking directly at Eshe, daring her to respond. Eshe never did. Gwen was crueler in a different way. She operated through her phone. She'd text Chidi memes mocking wives who don't know when to let go. She'd send him links to articles about how to leave a marriage without losing everything. She'd post stories on her social media about women who peak in the kitchen and never grow, and everyone in the family knew exactly who she was talking about. To Gwen, Eshe's silence was weakness. She didn't understand that sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes silence is just a woman deciding what she's going to do next. Vivian, meanwhile, was growing bolder by the day. She'd send Chidi gifts to the house. New suits, designer watches, bottles of expensive cologne wrapped in tissue paper with her initials on the card. Eshe found a shopping bag in the closet one evening. Inside was a receipt from a boutique she couldn't afford to walk into. $3,000 for a jacket. She stared at that receipt for a long time, standing in the closet with the light swinging overhead. Then she folded it neatly, put it back exactly where she found it, and said absolutely nothing. One night, after Lorraine had gone home and Chidi had disappeared again, and the house was so quiet it hummed, Eshe sat down on the bathroom floor. She didn't sob. She didn't shake. She didn't scream into a pillow or throw something against the wall. She just sat there, knees pulled to her chest, the gold locket in both hands, whispering her grandmother's words, like a prayer she was afraid to stop saying. "You are worth more than they will ever know. You are worth more than they will ever know." Her hands trembled. Her eyes were dry but completely hollow, like someone had scooped the light right out of them. This was the lowest point. A woman who had poured herself empty into people who treated her like she was nothing, sitting on a cold tile floor in a house she paid for, holding the only thing that still told her she mattered. The next morning, still wearing the clothes she'd slept in on that bathroom floor, Eshe picked up her phone. There were now 7 voicemails from attorney Elaine Warren. She had ignored them all, assuming it was a scam or a wrong number, but something made her press play on the last one. Elaine's voice was firm but kind, the voice of a woman who had spent her career delivering life-changing news. "Ms. Carter, you are the sole beneficiary of a substantial estate. Please contact me before the probate deadline. This is not a solicitation, this is real, and it cannot wait." Eshe replayed the message. Then she replayed it again. Her fingers trembled against the screen. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Tired eyes, wrinkled clothes, the locket hanging over her heart. She didn't tell Chidi. She didn't tell Lorraine. She didn't tell a single soul. For the first time in 11 years of marriage, Eshe kept something entirely for herself. 2 weeks later, Eshe sat in attorney Elaine Warren's downtown office in a leather chair that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. The office smelled like old books and fresh flowers. Elaine sat across from her, a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked locks, sharp eyes, and a calm authority that filled the room without effort. She laid everything out slowly, carefully, watching Eshe's face the way a doctor watches a patient before delivering results. Theodore Raymond Carter, Eshe's great-uncle, Ruth's younger brother, the man who left Augusta before Eshe was born and never came back. He had spent 60 years quietly building one of the most remarkable private investment portfolios in American financial history. Real estate across 4 states, equity stakes in 12 major corporations, a private art collection worth hundreds of millions, and liquid assets that made most billionaires look like they were still getting started. $40 billion, all of it left in a handwritten will to one person. The letter attached to the will, written in Theodore's own shaky hand, read, "She is the only one in this family who never asked me for a thing. She never wrote me looking for money. She never called me looking for favors. She is the only one who carries Ruth's heart. Give her everything. She will know what to do with it." Eshe didn't scream. She didn't jump up. She didn't gasp or cover her mouth or fall to her knees the way people do in movies. She sat perfectly still, her hand resting on the gold locket, and tears rolled silently down her face. Not tears of joy, not tears of shock, tears of something deeper and older. The kind of tears that come when the universe finally answers a prayer. You stopped praying so long ago, you forgot you ever whispered it. Then Elaine told her the rest, and the rest changed everything. Calvin Monroe, the insurance agent, had contacted Elaine's firm directly. He was a man of principle, and what he had witnessed in his office that afternoon had kept him awake for 3 nights straight. He explained everything. How Chidi had walked in with a woman who was clearly not his wife. How they had laughed together while signing forms that would profit from Eshe's death. How the beneficiary was hidden inside a shell trust designed to conceal Vivian's name. Calvin had flagged a life insurance policy, $5 million, recently taken out on Eshe's life, with Vivian listed as the sole beneficiary. The policyholder was Eshe's husband, Chidi. Calvin told Elaine he couldn't sleep knowing what he knew. He said he'd cooperate with any investigation. He said he'd testify if it came to that. Elaine slid the documents across the polished desk. Eshe picked them up with steady hands. She saw Chidi's signature in blue ink, the same handwriting that had once signed their marriage certificate, that had once written her love notes on post-its stuck to the bathroom mirror, back when love still lived in that house. She saw Vivian's name printed neatly inside the trust documents. She saw her own name, her full name, the name her grandmother gave her, the name that was now attached to $40 billion, listed as the insured, the person whose death would make 2 strangers rich. And for the first time in 11 years, the softness in Eshe's eyes shifted into something else. Not anger, not bitterness, not revenge, clarity, The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop making excuses for people who never once made room for you. She looked up at Elaine and asked one question. Is everything legal on my side? Elaine nodded slowly as she placed the documents back on the desk, touched the locket at her throat, and said quietly, "Then I know what to do." 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of silence so thick it had its own weight. 3 weeks of Esha continuing to wake up before dawn, continuing to go to work, continuing to mop the same hallways and clean the same rooms at Mercy General. 3 weeks of cooking meals Chidi didn't eat and folding laundry Chidi didn't acknowledge, and enduring Lorraine's visits and Gwen's mockery and the slow, suffocating weight of a marriage that had died long before anyone was willing to say it out loud. But something in Esha had changed, not something visible, not something Chidi would have noticed even if he had been paying the slightest attention to his wife, which he was not. Something quiet, something internal, something behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. Like a tide turning deep beneath the surface in the middle of the night, where nobody can see it and nobody can stop it. Then came the night of the gala. Chidi's real estate firm hosted its annual charity event at the Grand Linden Hotel downtown. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a live jazz quartet in the corner, 300 guests in black tie and evening gowns. This was Chidi's stage. The one night a year he got to stand at a microphone and pretend he was the man he always wished he'd become. He'd told Esha not to come. "It's a professional event," he'd said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror without looking at her. "You wouldn't fit in." She'd said nothing. He took her silence as agreement. He always did. Chidi stood on stage in a tailored black tuxedo, microphone in hand, thanking his colleagues, his investors, his family, his support system. Vivian stood beside him in a floor-length red gown, her hand resting on his arm like she'd been there all along, like she was the wife and Ishi was the ghost. Lorraine sat in the front row, beaming, her chin lifted like a queen watching her prince. Gwen was beside her, phone raised, recording everything. Terrence sat further back, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring at the floor like a man counting down to something he didn't want to witness. Chidi was mid-sentence, and something about gratitude, something about the people who believed in him. When the double doors at the back of the ballroom opened, Eshe walked in, but this was not the Eshe they knew. This was not the woman in stained scrubs and scuffed shoes. This was not the woman who stood in doorways holding grocery bags while people laughed. She wore a custom black gown that moved like dark water when she walked. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist. Her shoulders were back, her chin was level, and around her neck, catching the chandelier light like a small, steady star, was the gold locket. Attorney Elaine Warren walked beside her in a tailored charcoal suit. 2 private security officers followed 3 steps behind. The room turned. Conversations died mid-word. Forks paused in mid-air. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. 300 heads swiveled toward the woman walking down the center aisle of that ballroom like she owned the building. And in a way, she could have bought it twice over without checking her balance. Chidi's voice faltered. He gripped the microphone stand. "Eshe, what are you doing here?" She didn't stop. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice or quicken her step. She walked to the stage with the terrifying calm of a woman who had already rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times and decided exactly how it would end. She reached the podium and took the microphone from Chidi's hand, gently, almost tenderly, the way you take a dangerous object from a child who doesn't understand what they're holding. She looked out at the audience, 300 faces staring back at her. Then she spoke. "My name is Eshe Ruth Carter. I am the sole heir to the estate of Theodore Raymond Carter, $40 billion. The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the ice shifting in glasses across the room. Lorraine's smile dissolved. Gwen's phone slipped to her lap. Vivian's fingers fell away from Chidi's arm like they'd been burned. Eshe continued, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. And the man standing behind me, my husband, took out a $5 million life insurance policy on my life 3 weeks ago. He listed his mistress as the beneficiary. She held up the documents, copies of the policy, the trust paperwork, Chidi's signature, Vivian's name. Every camera phone in that room came up at once. Flashes popped across the ballroom like lightning in a bottle. She turned to face Chidi. He was frozen in place, mouth slightly open, eyes wide, looking like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time and understanding, finally, that he had built it on sand. She looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with the quiet devastation of a woman seeing clearly for the first time the man she had wasted a decade loving. "You called me disposable," she said, her voice soft enough that the room had to lean in to hear. "Your mother said I smelled like floor wax. Your sister recorded me like a joke. Your girlfriend sat in my chair at my own table and ate food I paid for. But none of you, not a single one of you, ever asked who I was. You only ever saw what you wanted me to be, and what you wanted me to be was small, because my smallness made you feel big." She reached up and touched the gold locket. She opened it carefully, the way you open something sacred, and in a voice that didn't waver, didn't crack, didn't tremble, she read her grandmother's words aloud to that silent room. "You are worth more than they will ever know." She closed the locket. She placed the microphone gently on the podium, and she turned and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Elaine followed. The security officers followed. The heavy doors closed behind them with a sound like a book shutting for the last time. Chidi stood on that stage in front of 300 people and could not produce a single word. Vivian had already stepped backward into the shadows. Lorraine sat rigid in her chair, her face the color of ash. Gwen's phone lay dark in her lap. The only sound in the room was the jazz quartet, still playing softly in the corner, as if even the music didn't know what else to do. The footage from that gala hit the internet before midnight. Someone near the front had recorded the entire speech on their phone and uploaded it with the caption, "She came back for her crown." Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 20 million times. News outlets picked it up. Financial channels ran it alongside Theodore Carter's obituary. Daytime talk shows replayed the clip of Eshe reading from the locket. Social media turned her into something larger than herself, a symbol, a story, a mirror for every person who had ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love them most. Chidi's world came apart like wet paper. His real estate firm released a public statement, distancing itself from him within 48 hours. His clients pulled their contracts. His broker license was placed under formal review. The life insurance policy triggered a federal investigation. Calvin Monroe had already cooperated fully, turning over every document, every email, every recorded conversation from the day Chidi and Vivian walked into his office, smiling like they had gotten away with something. Chidi's attorney told him to cancel all public appearances, stay off social media, and prepare for the very real possibility of criminal charges for conspiracy and insurance fraud. Chidi sat in his empty living room, in the same house Eshe had cleaned for 11 years, and stared at the wall where their wedding photo used to hang. She had taken it with her, not out of sentiment, out of closure. Vivian vanished like smoke the morning after the gala. She blocked Chidi's number before sunrise. She emptied her desk at the real estate office and left without telling anyone where she was going. 2 weeks later, someone from Gwen's circle spotted her on social media at a beachside resort in Miami, draped over a new man in a linen shirt, smiling like the name Chidi had never once crossed her lips. She had never loved him. She had loved what he promised her. Access, money, the fantasy of a life she didn't want to build herself. and the moment that fantasy crumbled, she stepped over the rubble without looking down. Lorraine tried to reach Esha. She called 5 times, 6, 7, 8. Every call went to voicemail. She even drove to the old house, but it was empty. Curtains drawn, driveway bare. Eshe had moved out weeks ago. Lorraine sat in her parked car in the driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the front door like it owed her an explanation. Her friends at church had already begun to distance themselves. One woman, a deacon's wife who had known Lorraine for 30 years, said it to her face at a Wednesday evening Bible study. "You threw away a billionaire daughter-in-law because she worked with her hands and didn't wear designer clothes. That's not pride, Lorraine. That's the kind of foolishness the Lord warns us about." Lorraine didn't go back to that Bible study. She didn't go back to that church at all. Gwen deleted every one of her social media accounts after strangers flooded her comments with screenshots from the gala, side-by-side images of Vivian sitting in Eshe's chair, and clips of Gwen herself laughing while Eshe stood in the doorway holding groceries. She changed her phone number. She told her remaining friends she had no idea about the insurance policy, but nobody believed her. She had spent years mocking Isha in public, and the internet does not forget. Terrence did something none of them expected. He didn't call, he didn't text, he didn't show up unannounced asking for anything. He sat down at his kitchen table, pulled out a sheet of paper, and wrote a letter by hand. It wasn't long. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't ask for money. It didn't make excuses. It said, "I should have spoken up at that dinner table, Esha. I should have spoken up every single time they laughed at you, every time my mother said those things, every time Chidi made you feel like you didn't matter. I didn't, and I have to live with that. I'm sorry. You deserved better from all of us, but especially from me. Because I knew it was wrong, and I sat there and said nothing." He mailed it to Elaine Warren's office. Elaine forwarded it to Esha. Eshe read it sitting on the porch of her new home on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the locket resting against her collarbone. She read it twice. Then she folded it neatly along the creases and placed it on her nightstand, right beside her grandmother's locket. She didn't write back. She didn't call, but she didn't throw the letter away either. And sometimes that's the most grace a person can offer. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the simple act of not discarding someone the way they discarded you. 6 months later, on a quiet morning in early October, when the air had just begun to cool and the leaves were starting to turn the color of rust and honey, Eshe sat on the front porch of a modest home on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where nobody knew her face from the news. The house was not a mansion. It was not a penthouse. It was not the kind of home that $40 billion could have bought. It was warm. It was sunlit. It had a garden out back with tomatoes and basil and marigolds. It had wind chimes on the porch that sang softly when the breeze came through. She had chosen peace over spectacle. She had chosen quiet over noise. She had chosen to live like Ruth, not like the world expected a billionaire to live. She had used a portion of the inheritance to establish the Ruth Carter Foundation, named in her grandmother's honor. The foundation funded full-ride scholarships for first-generation Black college students. It built community health clinics in neighborhoods that had been forgotten by the system. It provided transitional housing and free legal aid for women escaping abusive or manipulative marriages. And it ran a mentorship program for young girls who reminded Eshe of herself at 10 years old, sitting on a porch in Georgia, not yet knowing what the world would try to take from her. Eshe didn't put her own face on any of it. She put Ruth's. That particular October morning, a young girl from the mentorship program came to visit. She was 14 years old, quiet, with neat braids and a backpack slung over one shoulder. She had a nervousness in her eyes that Eshe recognized instantly, the look of someone who had been told over and over by people who should have built her up that she wasn't enough, that she was too quiet, too plain, too invisible to matter. Eshe sat beside her on the porch. The morning sun warmed their knees. Eshe reached up and unclasped the gold locket from around her neck. She opened it carefully and showed the girl what was inside: the tiny, faded photograph of Ruth as a young woman, and the folded note, soft as cloth now from decades of being held. The girl read the words aloud, slowly, carefully, like she understood that these words were older than both of them and heavier than they looked. "You are worth more than they will ever know." Eshe smiled, not a wide smile, a deep one, the kind that starts behind the eyes. "My grandmother gave me this locket when I was about your age," she said. "And it took me 30 years to believe what that note says. 30 years of scrubbing floors and cooking for people who never thanked me and loving a man who forgot I was alive. Don't you wait that long, sweetheart. Don't you dare wait that long." The girl looked at the locket, then at Eshe, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind chimes turned slowly in the breeze. Then the girl whispered, "Thank you." And Eshe, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt her grandmother's hand resting gently on her shoulder. Even though no one was there, she closed the locket. She clasped it back around her neck. She looked out at the garden, at the tomato plants bending under their own weight, at the marigolds turning their faces toward the sun, at the light catching the edges of the wind chimes as they spun. And for the first time in this story, Eshe exhaled fully, not a sigh of pain, not a breath of exhaustion, not the kind of air you let out when you're just trying to survive another hour. A breath of peace, the kind of breath that comes when you finally stop carrying the weight of people who never deserved to be carried. Some people will only see your value when the world tells them what you're worth. They need a number, they need a headline, they need a gala and a gasping crowd, and $40 billion on a screen before they understand what was standing in front of them the whole time. But the ones who matter, the ones who truly, deeply matter, they saw it when you were scrubbing floors at 5 in the morning with aching knees and still came home to cook dinner for people who didn't deserve a single plate. Your worth was never the money. It was never the inheritance or the headlines or the gala or the look on their faces when the truth came out. It was always the heart. It was always the locket. It was always the woman who kept going when the whole world told her to stop. If this story moved something inside your chest, if you've ever been the person they underestimated, the one they laughed at, the one they called disposable, the one they threw away like yesterday's newspaper, then you already know why this matters. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next story might be even closer to your heart than this one. And share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Someone who's sitting on their own bathroom floor right now, holding whatever their locket is, wondering if they matter. Tell them they do. They'll thank you for it.